Great. John, I was delighted when I came across you and we were introduced. I've been looking for a long time for somebody who'd actually done it rather than wanted to talk about it. And it seems to me that I look here at the beginning of your short presentation that you're going to share with us today, and I can see somebody who's actually got a tour operation, traveling all over the world. I was amazed when I saw the list of countries that you're able to operate to. Really amazed, shocked almost. Shocked with delight, I hasten to add, but nonetheless shocked. You've got a thing that works on providing solutions so that you're actually sharing the expertise that you've developed. And you've got the Include Me Travel campaign as well. So you really are all over this, aren't you? And what's also unusual for me is that this is a very progressive piece of work coming out of America, which, to be honest, we don't often see in travel and tourism. So I'm very excited to hear from you today. And thanks for making time to talk to me. But really, I'm in your hands. Do you want to explain what you do and why you do it? And don't hold back, John, because I really think what you do is amazing.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm a manual wheelchair user, and I spent a lot of time in my 20s traveling through Europe as a hobby. Just absolutely loved the culture and the food and the history and architecture and art and everything. And it was hugely time consuming to plan the trips. And every trip I would have surprises regarding accessibility. And I said, well, now that I've visited, I know how to do it better. And so I started a travel company. Our first company was Sage Traveling, providing accessible vacations for disabled travelers. And then we realized there wasn't a whole lot of people that were companies that were doing it in the B2B space. So we founded our second company, Accessible Travel Solutions. And then our most recent one, Include Me Travel, provides a variety of other services, consulting services to businesses. But essentially, accessible travel is difficult, and I think that's where I want to start is on the next slide, talking about what makes accessible travel difficult. So here are just some of the examples, and these are the common things that we experience as disabled travelers. These are the challenges, and it starts in the pre-trip planning process, but then you get on the plane and using the bathroom can be difficult. Getting from the airport to the hotel, finding a hotel with your specific accessibility needs, measurements, pictures, to actually book the accessible room, not just request an accessible room, but to actually secure the accessible room can be a challenge. Getting around the destination, so that's public transportation, pedestrian routes, private transportation, attractions. You can see the stairs down there at Pompeii. Bathrooms, that's a big thing that most able-bodied tour providers don't think about, is finding accessible bathrooms can be a real challenge. Getting your answers before the trip and having emergency assistance during the trip, because when a problem happens to a disabled traveler, let's say there's a train strike, and so you can't get, the trains aren't running between Rome and Florence. Well, an able-bodied traveler just jumps on a motor coach, but that motor coach doesn't have a lift. And so it's a big problem for a disabled traveler to get between those cities. And they have a reservation in the hotel, an accessible hotel that night, and they need to figure that out. So these are all examples of challenges, but what's important to understand is how this affects the disabled traveler. And so there's anxiety and there's concerns about choosing a destination and choosing a travel company. And so the real key message here is that businesses and destinations need to gain consumer trust. They need to be proactive and actually gain that trust. And I think that's something that's missing from a lot of destinations, a lot of businesses. There's not enough proactive activities going on.
John, it would be incredible, wouldn't it, to think that you booked a room that matched your disabilities, and then you get there and you find you haven't got the disabilities room. I had a student some years ago now who was also a manual wheelchair user, and he graphically illustrated to our class how much it mattered which side of the bath the rail was on the wall to help him to get in and out of the bath. That actually the detailed layout of the room was important. It wasn't enough that he just knew it was a room for disabled people. Some of the detail of what was in that room was also critically important to his ability to use it. And I assume that that's often a problem for people traveling with disabilities.
Absolutely. Bed heights and balcony doors, how specifically they work. But then there's also some customer service components of it. So every hotel that I've ever been in, I leave the handheld shower hanging down so I can reach it. And every day the housekeeping service goes in and puts it back out of reach.
Yeah.
And so that's something that is not being trained. There's a training component in this.
Yes, I'm sure that's not done maliciously. That is simply lack of thought and lack of training. Okay, let's go on.
Sure.
I'm excited by this. Next slide.
Yeah, sure. So this is an important concept. And I know that last page can seem intimidating for providers and destinations. But what needs to be understood is that accessibility is a range. It's not an on-off switch. It's not compliant versus not compliant to some legal standard. It's a range. And so this is one of the ways, this is specific to destinations. And I'll step through this just to explain how destinations can vary in their accessibility. So I'll start at the bottom. It's sort of high-risk travel. So that's something where accessibility is maybe not in the national building codes. There are maybe severe natural features that are difficult. So think, Cinque Terre or some hillside destination. Now I've been there and I've figured it out, but it's difficult, and some of those sidewalks are steep or they're stairs and really some challenges there. Moving up is more common. This is sort of for the disabled traveler, you're on your own. You've got to figure it all out on your own. And this is—
John, sorry to interrupt you. It'd be really useful to have your kind of guess as we go along. That can only be a guess of what proportion of these travelers are falling into each of the categories.
Sure.
Yeah, so is this one the most common, or
on your
just
own
be helpful to have that for background?
I will. Let me step through them all, and then I'll give you.
Okay, no, that's fine.
Sure. So yeah, on your own, that's very common. A lot of destinations can't find a whole lot of information. Maybe there's some travel bloggers, accessible travel bloggers that have posted some things. Could be out of date, could be 10 years old, could be some post on TripAdvisor where somebody's answering a question, but they really don't understand your accessibility needs. And so maybe they're not answering exactly right. But you have to figure it out on your own. Lots of phone calls, lots of emails. This is what it was like, before I started my company. It's still like this in a lot of destinations. Then you move up, and this is what I call partial accessible trip planning is possible. So the destination may have some really helpful information on their website, on the free public website. And so that's great. That makes it a little less time consuming to plan the trip. You move up into specialist packages. So these are accessible travel specialists who can plan the trip for you and answer all your questions and provide the emergency support. That's what we do at Sage Traveling. We do it in a lot of destinations. We don't do it in all destinations. So there are quite a few destinations where that doesn't exist.
John, how many destinations are you able to do that in?
We're in 50 countries and growing. So a lot of
still a long way to go.
Yeah. The mainstream packages. So this is mainstream travel companies, the ones that have the big reach and they have purchasing power and they can plan your trip for you. Not a whole lot. That really a lot of destinations, the mainstream travel companies don't really provide everything that a disabled traveler needs. And so that's something that we're working on to improve because we think that's important. Number two is comprehensive. So this is a destination that provides where a disabled traveler can plan their whole trip using free public website. That's also not present in a whole lot of places. There's probably just a handful that really are comprehensive there. And then the ideal is that you can just show up, just like an able-bodied visitor. You just show up. Oh, you walk or roll into a hotel. They have rooms available, accessible rooms available. They meet all your needs. This is sort of the dream. But to answer your question, where are destinations?
Before you do that, I must ask you: does that exist anywhere? To just show up?
It depends on your accessibility needs.
Right.
Okay. It doesn't exist for all accessibility needs anywhere. There are some places. I'm a manual wheelchair user. I have needs that are. I get around pretty well. I can do some transfers that are a little bit difficult. but no, I choose not to. I make reservations in advance. I do the research in advance because if it goes wrong, it's a really unpleasant experience.
Yeah. So it's a very rare thing, basically, is what
Yeah.
it is.
So what I would say is most destinations are in 4, 5, and 6 is really where they are. You know, we're in 50 countries, so we're covering a good bit of destinations that are at least 4. We want the destinations to provide more free public accessibility information. It needs to be detailed. It needs to be clear. It needs to be updated. You know, all these types of things. That's where most destinations are. It does vary by a lot of things. It's not just how engaged the destination is. There are real issues. I mean, if you visit a European town that was founded on top of a hill for medieval defense purposes, there's going to be some steep streets there. You know, it's going to be more difficult, and you may want a specialist or someone to assist you. And I will mention that, so this range is for destinations, these 7 levels, but it's similar for businesses. For travel businesses, there's also a range of accessibility. And the key thing, every destination, every travel business should be trying to move up. There should be active projects to improve their accessibility. I'll mention one other thing about destinations. There's really 2 things that destinations should do. They should make it easier for the disabled traveler to visit, and they should help their local providers do a better job serving those disabled travelers through training and things like that. Okay. We recently did some research for the World Travel and Tourism Council to come up with inclusive and accessible travel guidelines. And during that, we read through a bunch of existing research that you can see at the very bottom. There's been a lot of accessible travel research done. This is not a brand new field. There's been the research done. The implementation is the problem. And so you can read, I mean, there's thousands of pages of great information out there that you can read through, and we did. And what we did through all of this, through all the existing research, through my own experience traveling, through our experience planning trips for thousands of disabled travelers, through working with a bunch of the mainstream big companies, we really sort of tried to condense it down into the 7 keys to success in accessible travel. And this is what we came up with. And it's a little bit generalized. There's a lot that's behind this, but the way you can think about it is these are 7 checkboxes. And if a business or a destination wants to have a return on their investment, they need to check all these boxes. And so I'll step through these. The first one is about being accessible. And this is something that the people wrap their head around. They generally understand it. This is what they think accessibility is. I need to meet a legal standard. I need to meet Americans with Disabilities Act or some other legal standard. And then I check the box and then I'm done and then that'll be it. And so that's not quite it. We do say that the measuring stick should be the 7 principles of universal design. Those have been around for a couple decades now. And so that should be what it aspires to, not just to meet a legal standard. And the other key part is that it needs to be all trip components. So if the airline is good, but the hotel is bad, well, the trip's not going to go very well, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So it does need to be all components. The second part is a big component for gaining consumer trust, and it's something that's often overlooked, and that is demonstrating accessibility, showing accessibility. And so that's putting accessibility details, like we talked about in a hotel room, putting it on your website. And It's not just putting a few bullet points. It's not 10 bullet points. It's not 50 bullet points. It needs to be clear, detailed, and comprehensive. So it needs to have measurements. It needs to have photographs. It needs to show all the areas of the property, so that someone can judge for themselves if their accessibility needs will be met. And then once they see all that details, then they feel confident. And then they say, hey, I'm going to get there and I'm going to have a good experience. And so it builds consumer loyalty also. If you do a good job of this, they will come back again and again.
And presumably recommend others.
Yeah, exactly. The third aspect is around customer service and training. So essentially, if a place is universally accessible, you may not need to train train your staff, but that never really happens. I mean, universal accessibility is sort of an ideal. And so where a destination or a property is not universally accessible, there needs to be training about how to assist disabled travelers to navigate those accessibility barriers. So it may be the front desk explains, you know, when somebody checks in, they say, "Oh, I see you're in a wheelchair. Would you like me to remove the desk chair out of your room? Would you like me to bring a bench into the roll-in shower? By the way, to get to the hotel pool, there's steps this way, so use the ramp this way." These are all things that can be trained and make it easier, rather than, you know, I show up in a hotel and I have to explain, I have to tell them, I have to teach them what my needs are. And I don't know their property. That's a difficult thing for me to do. I know my needs, but I don't know their property.
Yeah.
And so there's a customer service component that can really make a difference. The fourth is around standardization. So again, around sort of traveler confidence. If every place that I go, the accessibility is different, you know, that makes me anxious. And so I really do want accessibility, you know, disabled travelers want accessibility to be standardized, not where it's different in this country, it's different in this region, it's different in this state. It needs to be standardized. And so there are some international standards through ISO and some other organizations that really destinations and businesses should strive to meet those. And 5, 6, and 7 are more sort of strategic. The first 4 are what disabled travelers need. The last 3 are strategic. So one is around leadership. And so, you know, you'd be amazed. A lot of destinations and travel businesses don't really have an accessibility vision that's documented. And if they do, it's part of DEI, but it doesn't really have a lot of specifics. And then it does, to be successful, it does need near-term targets, and it needs adequate resources. And so this is something that any of the viewers can do. You know, go in your organization, find out what's being spent on improving accessibility and who's working on it, improving accessibility, and what are the goals over the next year, over the next 3 years, over the next 5 years. And if those things aren't in place, well, all the rest of this doesn't really matter. You don't have the right resources. And so we're working on that. We're trying to build awareness and get those resources in place so that the businesses and destinations can improve. Number 6 is something that's a very common theme in the disabled community. Is there's a saying, nothing about us without us.
Yes.
And so, you know, rather than have someone who doesn't have a disability start designing, figuring out accessible travel products and things like that, you know, involving people with disability and people that have experience with accessibility is key. The last one is something that is also really missing. And so I mentioned number 2, the show accessibility is missing. It's a low cost thing. It's missing in a lot of places. Number 7 is the same way. I mean, think about it this way. It's around marketing. When was the last time that you saw a travel business or a destination, you know, advertising that they're really accessible and they welcome you and that they want you to come? It's really not being done. It's not being done in the mainstream media, but it's also even in the targeted online and offline communities, it's not being done. And it's cheap to do that.
Yeah.
So it's really something that's missing.
Are you finding a response to this now that you're putting it out there? Are you getting good take up?
The Sage 7, the 7 keys, I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of businesses, and they hold up. These 7 hold up. There's a lot behind them. It's generally, I get a lot of nodding, and people are in agreement with it. And they say, yeah, DEI is important to us. But it really comes back to, okay, well, what are you investing in doing this? And are you being proactive instead of reactive? What I hear a lot is, I say, you know, I start talking about accessibility, and they say, yeah, when a disabled person comes to us, we accommodate their needs as best we can. But if you haven't actually evaluated the hotels that you use in advance, if you haven't trained your people in advance, all of a sudden you're trying to make the disabled person the guinea pig to figure it out. And so a customized reactive strategy, it's slow, it's time consuming, it's expensive, it's risky. And so all these things, all the accessibility research and all the training and documentation and all that needs to be done in advance before the disabled person shows up on your doorstep. And part of the problem is if you don't do that in advance, you're not marketing. And so people aren't showing up anyway. And so it's sort of this cycle where if you're not, and that's what I think we see is a lot of people say, well, I don't get that many disabled requests, so why should I spend the time on it? Well, you're not getting the disabled requests because you're not documenting your accessibility, you're not training your salespeople, and you're not marketing, you're not doing all these things. And so I think that's what we're seeing is many people underestimate the size of the market. It's 20% of source markets, it's 15% of the global population, it's 20% of it more mature, developed countries. And so it's big and it's relatively untapped. I think it's the last untapped travel demographic.
And is that those figures you've just quoted, does that include the families who might be traveling with the person with disabilities?
It does not.
So that's a massive understatement then, isn't it?
Right. It is.
Presumably when you took your trip to Italy and the photograph is behind you, you went with your family, you didn't go on your own.
I did, yeah. The statistics are, the study that I've seen quoted is that a disabled person travels with an average of 1.9 companions.
Yeah.
And that's what my trip was. It was my wife, my daughter, and we traveled and had a great time in Italy.
Yeah. Great. Let's next slide, please.
I think that's the end of it.
Is it? I'm disappointed. Never mind. We'll do it again, John. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, I'm frustrated by the lack of progress we've had on disability access. In the Responsible Tourism Awards next year, we're going to take the risk again of having that category up for people to apply. It's a risk for us because, as you've so eloquently pointed out, there's not much of it out there. So I'm really keen that we try and get people to take seriously the opportunity to win a Responsible Tourism Award for their work on providing access for people who are differently abled. We'd really appreciate your help in pushing this, because I think it's one of the ways that we change people's understanding. It's not, if I'm honest, it's not so much that we want to pick out the industry best, although obviously we do. The real reason for doing it is not that. It's about demonstrating to others that they could do more and still be profitable businesses. That's the case across everything that we do. It's all about trying to pick out those people who have found solutions that work and that they have added to the prosperity of their business. That's what we're about. We're about trying to change the industry by picking out the leaders, if you like. So I'd really welcome your assistance with that, John, and the network that you have. But we're also setting up a platform for change, and there will be, part of that will be platforms on different kinds of disability. And again, your help in finding good solutions to put up there would again be massively appreciated. I want to take away the excuse of I just don't know what to do, really. I want to take that away from people and say, well, you know, there's somebody who's done it. Why don't you ask them? Is that something you'd be happy to help with?
Yeah, absolutely. And regarding the awards, what I would hope, you know, my dream is that it's not accessibility specialists and sort of local organizations that are winning these awards, that it's the big guys with the huge budgets are coming in and saying, hey, this is what we're doing for accessibility. We have a whole team of people making our business more accessible. That's the award that I want to see given. If it's just a bunch of localized organizations and accessibility experts, that's what's been done in the past, and accessibility has to come into the mainstream for it to really work.
John, I'm very happy to write the award that way, so long as you can assure me that we will get some people who enter for it.
All right, let's do it. I'll be speaking with some companies next week, and so we can see if we can.
We'll launch them on December the 1st, and I'll certainly involve you in that, and probably in the judging of that category as well. But I just think it's really important that we break through this. Like you, I'm very frustrated. I also have to say that there was a stage about 10 years ago when it looked as though I might end up in a wheelchair, and as it happens, I didn't, but I could have done. And I think people need to realize that the disabled are not a different group. They're you and me with disabilities, and none of us know whether we will end up in a wheelchair. It's a very salutary thing for me to actually have to confront the possibility of the way in which that would change my life. And I think there's too much of a tendency to think that access for those with disabilities is about the other, when actually it could very easily about you. I'll give you an example of that, really very powerful for me. I came back from Cornwall on the train, and a woman got on with a, I must say British Rail do it much better these days. She got on with her electric wheelchair. And I said to her, so what's life like? And she said, well, you notice I got blue hair? I had it dyed blue because I was fed up being talked about as the woman in the wheelchair. Now I'm talked about as the woman with the blue hair. And I thought that was a really neat example of the transformation that that young lady had made in the way she was perceived by others by doing something outrageous like dyeing half her hair blue. And you could just see what that meant to her, to be identified for herself rather than for the wheelchair that she was riding in. And that's why I'd like to see this happen. I just think people need to understand that it could easily be them. It's not about the other.
Absolutely.
So John, thank you very much. We will put this up with the links to your various activities and look forward very much to you being part of the Platform for Change.
Great, thanks for having me.
Thanks for your time, John. I really enjoyed that.